You've just seen actual footage of a serial killer publicly reenacting the murder of one of his victims. At no point during this reenactment did he show shame, express regret, or shed a single tear. It is one of the most notorious and horrific crimes that has ever happened in South Korea. A murder spree with 10 victims claimed in 3 short years. And it was all orchestrated by this man. A good-looking, charming father of 2 young boys with a thriving farm. This photo alone makes you think he's a regular family man with a love of dogs. But if you look closer, you'll notice he's wearing rubber gloves. The truth is, he isn't smiling in the photo because of his love for his dog. He's smiling because of what he's about to do to his dog. This is the case of Hwaseong Kang, the Ted Bundy of Korea. Kang Ho-Sun enjoyed a childhood that many people can only dream about. Born in the rural farming town of Sicheomyeon, he spent his days playing with his 4 siblings, helping on the farm, and living a life of relative wealth and peace. The town he lived in was safe and clean, and there was always food on the table and parents to turn to when he needed help. From a young age, he was known for being charming, friendly, and polite. While those traits didn't strike anyone as odd in his youth, he would evolve to one day use them to take advantage of vulnerable people in shocking ways. He attended a small agricultural high school that set him up for success, but at a young age, Kang found himself unmotivated and unsure of what to do with his life. Though this isn't unusual for anyone newly entering adulthood, Kang had a certain listlessness and apathy that made his parents and siblings feel uneasy. It wasn't typical angst or depression. It felt like something more. His friends or family had no way of knowing then, but budding psychopaths often struggle with feelings of intense apathy due to the structure of their brains. Feeling strong emotions, positive or negative, often requires incredibly intense stimuli. This can lead to psychopaths going one of 2 ways: turning to high-risk, high-reward activities, or struggling to turn to anything at all. Kang settled into working at his parents' farm, but they urged him to find his own purpose and meaning in life. Eventually, still unsure of what to do, Kang took a position in the South Korean military. However, he only remained at that position for a year and a half. While home on vacation for a holiday break, Kang was caught stealing cattle from another farm. The government didn't take this theft lightly and dishonorably discharged him in response. From there, Kang knew he couldn't return to the family business. He took a job driving agricultural trucks around Gyeonggi province, near where he grew up. By the time he was 22, he had been kicked out of the military, gotten a job as a trucker, and met his first wife. The two were married soon after they went on their first date, and almost immediately following their wedding, they had a son on the way. Shortly after the birth of their first son, they had another. They looked like a young, happy family that had been swept up in a beautiful fairy tale romance. But really, they were far from living a fairy tale. Their neighbors would later report that the couple spent most nights screaming at one another, frustrated by the crying of their 2 young boys. Kang was known to cheat and took great pride in how many women's numbers he could get, which sparked a fair share of arguments. Soon after their second son was born, Kang divorced his first wife and fled the countryside, moving north to Bipongmyeon, just south of the capital city of Seoul. He had grown frustrated with his way of life and his failed marriage, so he wanted to start over. But that was just the beginning of Kang's chaotic romances. In the next few years, he would be married 3 different times. The first 2 marriages came to be as whirlwind romances, where he charmed, doted on, and seduced women in a matter of weeks. But time and time again, as the months ticked on, cracks began to show. The women reported that Kang was aggressive in bed, quick to anger, and impatient. Soon after he got his second wife pregnant, he abandoned her, annoyed by the pressure of supporting another child. His marriage to his third wife lasted less than a year, and by the end of it, Kang's disdain for women began to show. He wanted women and enjoyed the power and sense of accomplishment wooing them gave him. Yet, at the same time, he looked down on them. Any hint of rejection or disapproval from them resulted in a furious response from Kang. Despite this, he soon found his next wife. It's important to note that the details of Kang's victims, including his wife, have primarily been wiped from the internet. Soon after Kang's killings were discovered, strict laws were put into place preventing the South Korean media from publicly giving details, showing photos, or displaying the names of the victims or perpetrators of crimes. The names of several of his victims remain available, but the stories of their lives live on only in the hearts of the people who loved and knew them. What is known about Kang's fourth wife is that she was a successful business owner. She owned a massage parlor in Ansan, where she offered Thai massages and massages meant to treat sports injuries. She quickly welcomed Kang into her business, and he began to work alongside her. At the same time, Kang managed his farm. He raised pigs, bees, and cattle for breeding and meat on the sprawling acreage, but it wasn't just livestock that Kang had on his property. At one time, he had dozens of stray dogs. He took several pictures with the dogs, beaming, wrapping his arms around them. Yet, he did unspeakable things to them when the camera wasn't on. For his twisted pleasure, he took to torturing and killing the dogs who trusted him with their lives. He often wore gloves to carry out his crimes. In just a year, Kang estimated that he killed around 50 dogs. Hurting animals is one of the leading signs of a psychopathic individual and is a red flag that many investigators look for. This desire to kill animals is often attributed to psychopaths' lack of empathy and their need for dramatic stimuli to evoke any sort of emotional reaction. In Kang's case, his desire for that sick emotional fulfillment was so strong that it didn't take long before killing animals failed to satisfy him. After a long day, Kang's wife and mother-in-law sat down for a cup of tea. They chatted like mother and daughters who have become friends do and bonded in the cozy kitchen as they traded stories. But within a matter of minutes, the house was engulfed in flames. The specific details of the fire vary, but what is known is that Kang fled out of a window with his two sons in tow, escaping the blaze. His mother-in-law and his wife, however, weren't so lucky. When firefighters arrived, the blaze had nearly completely destroyed the kitchen and had spread with such ferocity that there was no chance of rescuing either of the women. The firefighters insisted that the fire was accidental. However, the family of Kang's wife felt differently. They were quick to point out that the screws affixing the bar on the kitchen windows were securely tightened, almost as if they had been newly adjusted. However, the ones on the window that Kang and his children escaped out of were only half screwed in, allowing them to escape with ease. But it wasn't just the screws in the windows that had the family on edge. Just 5 days before the fire, Kang had gone with his wife to file a life insurance policy that would result in a payout of $500,000 in the event of his wife's untimely death. In addition, the same day, they formally filed their marriage with the government, making themselves husband and wife. The timing had the mourning family on edge, yet nothing came from it. At least, not for another few years. With the loss of his wife, Kang's true reign of terror began. 23-year-old Jung Hyun-yoon was on her way to work when a nice car pulled up beside her. With a charming smile and kind eyes, the man behind the wheel offered her a ride to her job at the local county office. Jung Hyun thanked the man and hopped in the car, but it only took a few seconds for her to realize she had made the biggest mistake of her life. Kang, the driver, began to drive in the opposite direction, taking her further and further away from the town center and forcing her to a remote area. When she protested and attempted to call someone for help, he snatched her phone from her hands and turned it off. Within the next few minutes, she had been violated, strangled with her stockings, and buried in the woods. Before Kang buried her, however, he removed her fingertips of the blade in an attempt to conceal her identity. It was Kang's first time murdering a person with his own hands, but it was far from his last. He would later tell the media that once he started, he just couldn't stop. After spending a few weeks following police reports and local gossip to make sure that no one suspected him of Jung Hyun's disappearance, Kang came to the sick realization that he could get away with murder. Since then, he had spent many nights prowling the streets of the night district of Ansan, and on December 14th, he found his next victim. Kyung-mi Ba was a 45-year-old woman who worked as a hostess at a karaoke bar. In Korea, hostesses are paid to flirt with customers and converse with them. Kang used this forced conversation to his advantage. He bought several drinks for Kyung-mi and made it his mission to seem as harmless as possible. He spoke about being a widower and about his love for his two sons. In addition, he showed photos of himself with his dogs, trying to disarm any woman who he came into contact with. Kang excelled at this strategy of charming victims, and he used it with every victim from that point forward. As Kyung-mi Ba was finishing her shift, Kang invited her to come back to his house for some drinks. Believing he was a kind, wealthy widower, Kyung-mi got into Kang's car. Once more, Kang drove her to a dark, remote area, violated her, and killed her with her own pantyhose. She was buried in a shallow grave in the woods. Just 10 days after murdering Kyung-mi-ba, Kang went to another karaoke bar. Here, he met 37-year-old hostess Park Sung-ah. Just like Kyung-mi, Kang wooed her with stories of his sons, dogs, and deceased wife. Figuring he wasn't a threat, Sung-ah got into Kang's car. Within the hour, she had been violated, strangled, and buried in a remote area. 3 other women suffered the same fate on January 3rd, January 6th, and January 7th, 2007. On January 3rd, Kang offered an office worker named Jung-ja Park a ride. By then, it's believed that he had modified his car to meet his sadistic needs. When suspects sat in the vehicle, the passenger seat would fall back, allowing Kang to tie them up and drag them into the back of the car, where he had removed seats to make room for his murders. 3 days later, he convinced another karaoke bar employee, Hae-young Kim, to get into his car. She too was buried in a remote area. The next day, 21-year-old Mi Young-yeon was making her way to university classes. When Kang saw her walking in cold, he saw a perfect chance to take advantage of her. After this string of murders in just a few weeks' span, Kang took a break to avoid detection. It wasn't until November 9th, 2008 that he struck again. This time, things were different for reasons that Kang still hasn't disclosed. Soo-hee Kim, who was 48, was a housewife in Suwon. Kang claims that she willingly got into his car, and soon after, he found himself drawn to her. He told law enforcement that he spent more time with Soo-hee than his other victims, and that throughout being with her, he grew fond of her. When investigators asked why he killed her, he told them that once you decide to kill, you can't just back out. But there was only one more murder Kang would be able to commit before finally he slipped up. Young Uk-an was just 19 years old. Because she was a university student who followed the same schedule every day, her parents became deeply concerned when she failed to contact them after several days. They spoke to the police, insisting that their daughter was missing. Police pulled footage from the surveillance cameras that had been installed at the bus stop just 2 weeks before her disappearance. That camera that was there by a mere fluke was the first crack in the case. Footage on the day of Young Uk's disappearance showed her getting into Kang's vehicle. But there was more. Just 4 hours later, an ATM caught this footage. Here, Kang uses Young Uk's card to withdraw money from her account. This was the first time he did this with any of his victims, and fortunately, the last. On January 27, 2009, police swarmed Kang's farm property. There, they discovered the car that had been used in his crimes was burnt to a crisp. In his home, they discovered at least 70 pairs of women's underwear and several clothing items. Many of the pairs of underwear were soaked with blood, serving as a haunting portrait of what he put his innocent victims through. Kang was promptly arrested, but it would take quite some time for law enforcement to get the answers they sought. For several days of questioning, Kang insisted that he didn't know anything. His demeanor was described as cocky, and it appeared that he wasn't taking the levity of his crimes seriously. Eventually, however, that facade began to fall. Slowly, over many weeks, Kang confessed to 8 murders, one by one. At first, officers didn't want to believe he had killed so many people. But as he sent them to the locations where the bodies were, they realized they had a serial killer on their hands. Kang was brought to the scene of his crimes to reenact them for law enforcement. While reenacting the crimes, he often made jokes and carried himself with a confident, unbothered demeanor. To many, this was a slap in the face. Some civilians arrived to gawk at the scene of the horrific crimes, while others came to protest. On April 22, 2009, Kang was sentenced to death for the murder of the 8 innocent women he killed. A case was opened to re-examine the house fire that killed his wife and her mother. In addition to the 8 murders, Kang was also charged with arson and the murder of his mother-in-law and wife. In prison, Kang has reportedly taken on the role of leader, bossing around fellow inmates. Even behind bars, it seems he can't let go of his twisted need for control. Though the victims' stories and the depths of their identities are sealed, their memories live on.